At 70 years old, Nancy Morrison learned the cruelest lesson life could teach. Blood isn't always thicker than water. Standing on a cold sidewalk with nothing but a worn coat, a cardboard suitcase, and her 12-year-old golden retriever, Max, she watched her own son close the door on her, not figuratively, literally. The sound of that lock clicking shut would echo in her memory for months to come. Her son had called her a burden, said she was draining his resources, said it was time she figured things out on her own. He took the house his father had left her, sold it for profit, and handed her $50 and a one-way ticket to anywhere but his life. But what her son didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that the abandoned cabin Nancy and Max would stumble upon during a November rainstorm held a secret that had been waiting 150 years to be discovered. A secret that would transform a 70-year-old homeless woman and her aging dog into the talk of Vermont. A secret that would make her son regret every cold word he'd ever spoken. This is the story of how loyalty proved more valuable than gold, how a dog's devotion saved both their lives, and how Nancy Morrison got the last laugh after all. But before we begin Nancy and Max's incredible journey, I want you to do something. If you believe that the loyalty of an animal is worth more than gold, if you believe that fate always holds a surprise for those who refuse to give up, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Nancy's story proves that it's never too late for a miracle, and you won't want to miss the powerful true stories we share every single week. Now, let's go back to that cold November morning when everything changed. November 18th, 2019. The morning started with a conversation Nancy had been dreading, but somehow knew was coming. Her son, Derek, 42 years old and increasingly resentful of his widowed mother's presence in what had been her own home, sat her down at the kitchen table with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation." Nancy had been widowed for 2 years. Her husband Thomas had died of a heart attack in 2017, leaving her the house they'd lived in for 38 years. But 6 months ago, struggling with the property taxes and maintenance on her limited Social Security income, she'd made a terrible mistake. Derek had convinced her to sign the house over to him for estate planning purposes. He'd promised she could live there as long as she wanted. That promise lasted exactly 5 months. "I've sold the house," Derek said flatly, not meeting her eyes. "The buyers want to move in by December 1st. That gives you 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live." Nancy felt the words like physical blows. "Derek, this is my home. You promised." "I promised when I thought you'd be reasonable," he interrupted. "But you're not, Mum. You're 70 years old. You can barely take care of yourself, let alone this house. And frankly, I can't afford to keep subsidizing your life. The sale gives me enough to pay off my debts and invest in my business. You'll have to figure something out. Where am I supposed to go?" Nancy's voice shook. "I have $847 in my bank account. That's not enough for first month, last month, and deposit on even the cheapest apartment." "That's not my problem," Derek said, standing up. "You have 2 weeks. I'd suggest you start looking." As he walked toward the door, Nancy called after him. "What about Max?" Derek turned back, looking at the old golden retriever lying in his bed by the fireplace. Max had been Thomas's dog, adopted as a puppy 12 years ago. He was graying around the muzzle now, moving a bit slower, but still loyal and loving. "Definitely can't take him," Derek said dismissively. "My lease doesn't allow pets. You'll have to surrender him to a shelter or have him put down." "Put down?" Nancy felt horror flood through her. "He's healthy. He's just old. Then take him with you," Derek shrugged. "But good luck finding a place that'll take a 70-year-old woman and a senior dog. Nobody wants that liability." He left without another word. Nancy sat in silence for a long time, then walked over to Max and knelt beside him with difficulty, her 70-year-old knees protesting. The dog looked up at her with warm brown eyes and thumped his tail against the floor. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, running her hand over his soft golden fur. "I'm so sorry I got us into this mess." Max licked her hand, as if to say it wasn't her fault. Over the next 2 weeks, Nancy tried everything. She called every apartment complex, Every room for rent listing, every possibility. But Derek had been right about one thing. Nobody wanted to rent to a 70-year-old woman on Social Security with a large senior dog. The few places that would consider her wanted deposits and fees totaling over $2,000. She had $847. She considered surrendering Max to a shelter, but when she called, they were honest. A 12-year-old large breed dog would likely be euthanized within days. Nobody adopted senior dogs. She couldn't do it. Max had been Thomas's companion, and in the 2 years since Thomas died, Max had been her companion. She would not betray that loyalty. On November 30th, the day before the new owners took possession, Derek returned with a truck. "Time's up, Mom, let's go." "Where are you taking me?" Nancy asked. "Bus station. Here's $50. It'll get you a ticket somewhere. From there, you're on your own." Nancy packed what she could carry into one cardboard suitcase and a small bag. Clothes, a few photographs, Thomas's watch, a blanket, everything else. Furniture she and Thomas had bought together, dishes from their wedding, books they'd collected, a lifetime of accumulated memories, stayed behind. Derek didn't offer to store anything, didn't offer to help beyond the ride to the bus station. At the curb, as Nancy climbed out with her meager belongings and Max on his leash, Derek handed her the $50 bill. "This is it," he said. "Don't call me. Don't show up at my work. I need to move on with my life, and I can't do that while I'm worrying about you." "You're not worried about me," Nancy said quietly. "If you were, you wouldn't be doing this." Derek's face hardened. "You made your choices. You should have been more financially responsible. You should have planned better. I can't fix your mistakes." He pulled away from the curb without another word. Nancy stood on the sidewalk outside the bus station, holding Max's leash in one hand and her cardboard suitcase in the other. It was late afternoon, cold and grey, threatening rain. She looked down at Max, who looked back at her trustingly. "I'm so sorry," she said again, her voice breaking. "You deserve so much better than this." Max pressed against her leg, offering comfort the only way he knew how. Nancy looked at the bus station, then at the $50 in her hand. That would buy a ticket to where? Another city where she knew no one, where she'd be just as homeless but farther from anything familiar. She thought about trying to find a shelter, but most didn't allow dogs. The ones that did had waiting lists months long. She was 70 years old, homeless with less than $900 to her name, a cardboard suitcase, and a 12-year-old dog who depended on her. A light rain began to fall. Nancy made a decision. She couldn't afford a bus ticket and food and any kind of shelter, but she could walk, and she knew there were forests outside the city, areas where people rarely went. If she and Max were going to be homeless, they'd be homeless somewhere away from the cold stares and the pity. "Come on, Max," she said softly. "Let's go find somewhere we belong." She turned away from the bus station and began walking toward the edge of town, Max trotting faithfully beside her. Behind them, the bus station grew smaller. Ahead of them, the forest waited. Neither of them looked back. The walk to the forest's edge took 3 hours. Nancy had to stop frequently. She was 70 years old, not accustomed to long walks, carrying a suitcase that grew heavier with every step. Max, despite his age, handled it better, his years of daily walks with Thomas having kept him in decent shape. They followed the highway north out of Burlington, then turned onto smaller roads, then finally onto a dirt forestry road that led into the Green Mountain National Forest. By the time they left pavement behind, it was getting dark, and the light rain had become a steady drizzle. Nancy's feet ached, her back ached, her shoulders burned from carrying the suitcase. She was cold, wet, and more exhausted than she'd ever been in her life. "Just a little farther," she kept telling Max. "We'll find somewhere dry to stop." But the forest seemed endless. The dirt road stretched ahead into darkness, lined with dense pine and bare hardwood trees. No buildings, no shelters, nothing but wilderness. Nancy's steps grew slower. Her breathing became labored. Finally, as full darkness fell and the rain grew heavier, she stopped. "I can't," she gasped, setting down the suitcase. "Max, I can't go any farther. I'm sorry." She sat down heavily on the wet suitcase, not caring that rain was soaking through her thin coat. Every part of her body hurt. She was cold to the bone, and she realized, sitting there in the dark forest with rain pouring down, that she might actually die out here. Maybe that was for the best. She had no home, no money, no future. At least Max would... What? Die with her? The thought made her want to cry. Max whined and pushed his nose against her hand. She looked down at him, barely visible in the darkness. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This is all my fault. You should be in a warm house with someone who can take care of you, not out here with a useless old woman who can't even—" Max suddenly barked sharply and grabbed the hem of her coat in his teeth, pulling. "Max, stop, I can't—" He pulled harder, then released her coat and barked again, turning to look down the road, then back at her. His whole body was tense, alert, focused on something ahead. "What is it, boy?" Max barked again and took several steps down the road, then turned back to look at her expectantly. He wanted her to follow. "Max, I can't walk anymore. I'm done." The dog came back, grabbed her coat again and pulled with surprising strength. He wasn't giving up. Nancy looked at her loyal companion, this 12-year-old dog who'd stayed by her side through everything, who'd given up a warm home to be with her, who was now refusing to let her quit. "Okay," she said, her voice shaking. "Okay, Max, I'll try." She pushed herself to her feet with a groan that came from deep in her exhausted body. She picked up the suitcase, which now felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and she followed Max down the dark road. The dog moved with purpose now, occasionally stopping to make sure she was following, then continuing ahead. He'd caught the scent or sound of something. She had to trust that he knew what he was doing. They walked for what felt like another hour, but was probably only 15 minutes. Nancy's vision was starting to blur with exhaustion and cold. She was stumbling, barely staying on her feet. Then Max barked excitedly and bounded ahead, disappearing into the darkness. "Max!" Nancy called, panic cutting through her exhaustion. "Max, come back!" She hurried forward as fast as her aching legs would carry her, and suddenly the trees opened up slightly. Through the rain and darkness, she could barely make out a structure, a small building set back from the road, nearly invisible in the shadows. Max stood in front of it, tail wagging, barking to get her attention. Nancy stumbled toward the building, and as she got closer, she could see it was a cabin. Very old, clearly abandoned, but it had walls and what looked like most of a roof. The front door hung crooked on one hinge. Nancy pushed it open and stepped inside, Max right behind her. The interior was pitch black and smelled of mold and decay, but it was dry, more or less. She could hear rain on the roof, but it wasn't falling on her head. Nancy collapsed to the floor just inside the door, too exhausted to even explore further. Max pressed against her side and she wrapped her arm around him. "Good boy," she whispered. "Such a good boy, you saved us." She lay there on the floor of the abandoned cabin, soaked through, exhausted beyond measure, with no idea what tomorrow would bring. But she was alive, they were both alive, and they were out of the rain. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she'd figure out what to do. Within minutes, despite the cold and discomfort, Nancy fell into the deep sleep of complete exhaustion. Max stayed awake longer, his head resting on her chest, guarding her through the long night. Nancy woke to weak morning light, filtering through broken windows and gaps in the walls. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she tried to move. Max was already awake, sitting near her, watching her with concerned eyes. "Morning, boy," she said, her voice hoarse. She sat up slowly, taking in their shelter for the first time in daylight. The cabin was small, maybe 400 square feet total, a single room with what had once been a sleeping loft, accessible by a ladder that was now missing several rungs. The structure was old, probably built in the early 1900s, constructed of hand-hewn logs that were still solid despite decades of neglect. But decades of abandonment had taken their toll. Windows were broken or missing entirely. The wooden floor was covered in dirt, leaves, animal droppings, and debris. The small stone fireplace in one corner was filled with old ashes, sticks, and what looked like an old bird's nest. Water stains on the walls showed where rain had leaked through gaps in the roof. It was objectively barely better than sleeping outside, but it had a roof, walls, and a door. It was shelter. Nancy pulled herself to her feet with great effort and did a more thorough exploration. There was no running water, no electricity, no furniture of any kind. In one corner she found an old metal bucket with holes rusted through the bottom. Against one wall was a crude wooden shelf, also in poor condition. Behind the cabin, she discovered an old outhouse collapsed and unusable, but she also found a small creek about 100 yards into the woods, running clear and cold over rocks. She had water, she had shelter, she had Max. That would have to be enough. "All right, Max," she said, returning to the cabin where the dog waited. "We need to make this work, just for a little while until I figure out what to do next. Can you help me?" Max wagged his tail. Nancy spent the rest of that first day doing what she could with no tools and no supplies. She used a stick as a makeshift broom to sweep the worst of the debris toward the door and outside. She gathered relatively clean pine branches to create a soft bed in the driest corner. She used her blanket to cover the most obvious gaps around the door. That evening, she divided the $50 Derek had given her in her mind. She needed food for both of them. She needed water containers. She needed matches or a lighter. The next morning, she and Max walked back to the edge of the forest, then hitched a ride into the nearest small town. With $30, she bought a large bag of rice, a smaller bag of dried beans, a box of matches, 2-gallon jugs of water, and a bag of inexpensive dry dog food for Max. It wasn't much, but it would keep them alive for a couple of weeks. She kept $20 in reserve, knowing she'd need it eventually. Back at the cabin, Nancy fell into a routine born of necessity. She woke with the sun. She fetched water from the creek. She cooked small portions of rice in an old can she'd found, using the fireplace. She shared everything with Max, splitting her meager meals with him despite his dog food. He was family. He ate when she ate. She talked to Max constantly. With no other company, the dog became her sole companion and confidant. "Max, do you think we should try to seal that window?" she'd ask, as if he might answer. "Good morning, handsome. Did you sleep well?" she'd say each day as he woke and stretched. "Thank you for staying with me. I know this isn't the life you deserved," she'd tell him each night. Max listened to everything, his warm brown eyes attentive, his tail wagging whenever she spoke his name. Sometimes Nancy felt silly talking to a dog like he was human, but most of the time, she was just grateful not to be completely alone. The days grew shorter and colder as November became December. Nancy knew winter was coming, and she had no idea how they'd survive it in this cabin, with no heat source beyond the small fireplace, no warm clothes, no protection from Vermont's brutal cold. She tried not to think about it, tried to live one day at a time. On December 10th, 3 weeks after they'd found the cabin, Nancy was trying to repair a section of the floor that felt dangerously weak. She'd found some flat stones by the creek and was attempting to shore up the soft area by placing stones underneath. Max was helping by investigating every corner of the cabin, sniffing intensely at things that interested him. Suddenly, he began barking excitedly and scratching at the floor near the fireplace. "Max, stop, you'll hurt your paws on those splinters." But Max wouldn't stop. He scratched harder, barked more urgently, then looked at Nancy as if to say, "Come here, look at this." "What is it, boy?" Nancy walked over and knelt beside him, examining the floor where he'd been scratching. At first, she didn't see anything unusual, just old dirty wooden boards like the rest of the floor. But then she noticed that one board, about 3 feet long, looked slightly different from the others. The grain was the same, the aging was the same, but the edges were cleaner, as if this board had been cut more precisely, and when she pressed on it, it moved slightly. "Did you find something, Max?" Nancy worked her fingers into the gap at the edge of the board and pulled. The wood was old and stubborn, but it wasn't nailed down. After several attempts, the board lifted free. Beneath it was a hollow space, about 2 feet deep and 3 feet square, and in that hollow space was a box. Nancy's heart began to pound. She reached down and carefully lifted the box out. It was heavy, made of metal about the size of a small suitcase, with a simple latch that wasn't locked. "Max, what did you find?" she whispered. Max wagged his tail and barked once, clearly pleased with himself. Nancy carried the box to the area where afternoon light came through the largest window. Her hands shook as she worked the latch open. Inside the box, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but was now mostly rotted away, were dozens of small bags. Nancy opened one carefully. Gold coins spilled into her palm. She gasped and nearly dropped them. Then, with shaking hands, she opened another bag. More coins. A third bag. More coins. The box was filled with bags of gold coins. Nancy sat back, her mind reeling. She picked up one of the coins and examined it. Even with her limited knowledge, she could tell it was old. Very old. The date stamped on it was 1847. There had to be hundreds of coins in this box. Maybe thousands. "Max," she breathed. "Max, you found treasure. You found actual treasure." The dog pressed against her side, tail wagging, completely unaware that he'd just changed their lives forever. Nancy carefully examined more of the coins. They appeared to be from the mid-1800s, various denominations, all gold. Some had strange designs she didn't recognize. Some were in remarkable condition. Others were worn. At the bottom of the box, she found a small book, leather-bound, the pages yellowed and fragile. She opened it carefully. It was a journal. The handwriting was old-fashioned and difficult to read, but she could make out the name on the first page, Ezekiel Stone, 1851. She read the first entry. "I have lived in these mountains for 20 years now, far from civilization and its corruptions. I came west with the 49ers, made my fortune in California gold fields, and returned east with enough to live simply and alone, which is all I've ever wanted. I've built this cabin to be my final home. I will live here until my death, content with solitude and nature. My gold is hidden where only the most determined searcher would find it. I have no heirs, no family, no one to leave it to. Whoever finds this cabin and has the wisdom to search carefully will have earned what I've left behind." Nancy read the entry 3 times, her hands shaking. This gold wasn't stolen. It wasn't blood money. It was the life savings of a hermit who died here probably 150 years ago, deliberately hidden for whoever might find it someday. She looked at Max, who sat patiently watching her. "You found it, Max. You brilliant, wonderful dog. You found it." She had no idea what the coins were worth. But gold was gold. Even if they were only worth their weight in gold, there had to be thousands of dollars here, maybe tens of thousands, maybe more. For the first time in 3 weeks, Nancy allowed herself to feel something she'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Nancy spent the rest of that day and all of the next carefully examining and counting the coins. There were 347 gold coins total, ranging from the 1840s to the 1870s, various denominations from different mints. She knew she needed expert help. These weren't just valuable as gold. They were historical artifacts, collectibles. Some might be rare, some might be incredibly valuable, but she also knew she had to be careful. She was a homeless woman living in an abandoned cabin. If she wasn't smart about this, someone could take advantage of her, or worse, accuse her of theft. She spent 2 days thinking through her options. Finally, she made a decision. Using 5 of the least distinctive coins, she walked to town and found a coin dealer. She told him she'd inherited some old coins and wanted to know what they were worth. The dealer, a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, examined them carefully. "These are 19th century gold pieces," he said. "In this condition, you're looking at about $400 to $600 each, just for the gold content. But if any of them have numismatic value, collector value, they could be worth significantly more." "How much more?" Nancy asked. "Depends on rarity, mint marks, condition. I'd need to examine them more carefully, compare them to value guides." "Why? Do you have more?" Nancy hesitated, then made a calculated decision. "I have a collection, nearly 350 coins, all from the same era. I need someone honest to help me value them and sell them properly." Robert's eyes widened. "That's a significant collection. May I ask how you acquired them?" "They were hidden in a property I own. Nancy said carefully. "The property has been in my family for generations. We found them while doing renovations." It wasn't exactly a lie. She did own the property now, in a sense. She'd been living there for 3 weeks. Squatters' rights had to count for something. Robert studied her for a long moment. Nancy was aware of how she must look. A 70-year-old woman in worn clothes, her hands rough from hard work, clearly not wealthy. "Mrs. Morrison, Nancy Morrison. Mrs. Morrison, if you truly have a collection of that size from that era, you're potentially sitting on a fortune, but you need to be very careful. This is the kind of thing that attracts all sorts of attention, some of it good, some not. Do you have documentation? Provenance?" "I have a journal," Nancy said. "Written by the man who collected the coins. His name was Ezekiel Stone. He lived in the 1800s. Robert's expression changed to one of deep interest. "That's excellent provenance. That journal could make the collection significantly more valuable. Would you be willing to bring everything here so I can examine it properly and give you an accurate assessment?" Nancy considered this. "If I bring it, what guarantee do I have that you won't just take it?" Robert smiled slightly. "Fair question. Here's what I propose. Bring everything to my shop during business hours. I'll examine each piece, photograph everything, and provide you with a detailed written assessment. I'll do this in front of witnesses. My assistant will be here the whole time. I'll give you my professional opinion on what each piece is worth and how to best sell them to maximize value." "What's your fee?" Nancy asked. "For the assessment?" "Nothing. If you decide to sell through me, I take a 15% commission. If you decide to sell elsewhere, you owe me nothing. Either way, you'll have professional documentation of what you own." It sounded fair. More importantly, Robert Chen seemed honest. "I'll bring everything tomorrow," Nancy said. That evening, back at the cabin, Nancy told Max about the plan. "Tomorrow we find out if we're rich, boy. If this works out, you're getting the biggest, softest dog bed money can buy. And steak. Lots of steak." Max wagged his tail and licked her hand. The next day, Nancy carried the box of coins to Robert Chen's shop. True to his word, his assistant was present the entire time. Robert spent 4 hours carefully examining each coin, photographing them, making notes, and consulting reference books and online databases. Finally, he sat back and looked at Nancy with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Morrison, you have an extraordinary collection here. Most of these coins are relatively common gold pieces from the California Gold Rush era, worth roughly their gold weight, about $400 to $800 each, depending on denomination. But you have 17 coins that are significantly more valuable." He pointed to a small group he'd set aside. "These include 3 1850s Liberty Head Eagles that are quite rare in this condition, worth about $15,000 each. You have 2 1861 Paquet Reverse Double Eagles, which are extremely rare. Each is worth at least $150,000, possibly more at auction. And this," he held up a single coin reverently, "this is an 1854 S Liberty Head, one of only 3 known to exist. At auction, this single coin could sell for over $1 million. Nancy felt the room spin. $1 million for one coin? Possibly more. The last comparable piece sold for $1.2 million. Combined with Ezekiel Stone's journal providing provenance, you have a documented historical collection. Collectors pay premium prices for that kind of background story." He paused, then continued, "Mrs. Morrison, the conservative estimate for this entire collection is approximately $2.8 million. If we take them to a major auction house and market them properly, you could see 3 to 4 million, possibly more." Nancy couldn't speak, couldn't process what she was hearing. $3 million. 3 weeks ago, she'd been homeless with $50 and a dog. Now she was a multi-millionaire. I don't understand," she finally managed. "How could something this valuable just be hidden in a cabin?" Robert smiled. "Happens more often than you'd think. Ezekiel Stone lived in a time before banks were trustworthy, before the FDIC. He didn't trust paper money. He converted his wealth to gold and hid it. Then he died, probably unexpectedly, and the secret died with him. Until Max found it," Nancy said softly. "Max? My dog. He's the one who found the loose floorboard. Robert laughed. Then Max just earned his keep for life. He already had, Nancy replied. But yes, he did. Over the next 2 weeks, Robert Chen helped Nancy navigate the complex process of selling the collection. He connected her with a reputable auction house in Boston. He helped her get the coins authenticated and graded. He made sure she understood every step of the process and every document she signed. The auction was held in January 2020. The final total after fees and commissions was $3.7 million. Nancy Morrison, who'd been homeless and penniless 2 months earlier, was now a multi-millionaire. The first thing she did was buy Max the biggest, softest orthopedic dog bed available, and a stake, a very large stake. The second thing she did was buy the land the cabin sat on. It was state forest land, but the cabin itself had been built on a small private inholding. She tracked down the owners who were thrilled to sell the useless acre of woods for $5,000. The cabin and the land it sat on were now legally hers. And then Nancy began to build. Nancy Morrison had spent 70 years of her life being practical, sensible, and conservative with money. She'd lived through hard times, raised a family on a tight budget, and learned to make every dollar stretch. But now, for the first time in her life, she didn't have to be practical. She could do whatever she wanted. And what she wanted was to transform the cabin that had saved her life into a real home. She hired a contractor who specialized in historic restoration. She explained what she wanted: preserve the original cabin's character and footprint, but make it solid, weatherproof, and comfortable. And I want a special room for my dog, she added, with his own space, his own bed, everything he needs. The contractor smiled. Most people want a media room or a wine cellar. A dog room is a first for me, but I love it. The work began in February and continued through the spring. Nancy stayed in a comfortable hotel in town during the renovation, bringing Max with her and paying the pet deposit without hesitation. Every few days, she'd drive out to check on the progress. The transformation was remarkable. The original log walls were carefully cleaned, restored, and sealed. A new roof was constructed using traditional methods that matched the cabin's 1900s origin. The windows were replaced with historically appropriate designs, but with modern, energy-efficient glass. Inside, the original stone fireplace was restored and equipped with a modern, safe wood-burning insert that would heat the entire space efficiently. The floor was completely rebuilt, with radiant heating installed underneath, but the surface finished with wide plank boards that matched the historic aesthetic. A small bathroom was added in what had been a storage area, with composting toilet and a shower that recycled grey water for the garden. A small but modern kitchen was installed with propane appliances and a hand pump at the sink that drew from a new well. Solar panels were mounted on the roof, hidden from ground view, providing electricity. A modern septic system was installed. Suddenly, this cabin that had been barely livable had all the comforts of a modern home, wrapped in the character of history. But Nancy's favorite part was Max's space. In the corner where she and Max had first slept on pine boughs, the contractor built a custom-raised platform with built-in storage underneath. On top was an orthopedic memory foam dog bed the size of a queen mattress, covered in soft washable fabric. Beside it was a built-in water and food station at just the right height for an aging dog. Low LED lighting provided a gentle nightlight. A heating pad was built into the bed for cold nights. "It's better than some people's beds," the contractor joked. "Max is better than most people," Nancy replied without a trace of humor. By June 2020, the transformation was complete. Nancy stood outside the cabin with Max beside her and marveled at what had been accomplished. The cabin looked almost exactly as it probably had when Ezekiel Stone built it 150 years ago. Solid log walls, stone chimney, cedar shake roof, small porch with rocking chairs. It was simple, rustic, and absolutely beautiful. But inside was every modern comfort, carefully hidden to preserve the aesthetic. Nancy had spent approximately $180,000 on the renovation. It was a lot of money. But she had plenty left. invested wisely with the help of a financial advisor Robert Chen had recommended. She furnished the cabin simply but comfortably, a real bed with a proper mattress, a table and chairs, a comfortable reading chair by the fireplace, shelves for books, everything she needed, nothing she didn't. She hung only 3 photographs on the walls, one of her late husband Thomas, one of her with Max, and one of the original cabin the day they'd found it, as a reminder of how far they'd come. The day she and Max moved in permanently, Nancy cooked her first meal in the new kitchen. Nothing fancy, just rice and beans, the meal that had sustained them through the hardest months. But this time, she cooked it on a proper stove, in a proper kitchen, in her own home. That night, she sat in her reading chair by the fire while Max lounged in his luxurious bed, and she read aloud to him from a book as snow fell softly outside the windows. "Max," she said, setting the book down and looking at her faithful companion, "I know you can't understand this, but you saved my life. Without you, I would have given up that night in the rain. I would have died out here, but you wouldn't let me quit. You found this cabin. You found the treasure. You gave me everything." Max's tail thumped against his bed. "So this isn't my house," Nancy continued. "It's our house. Everything I have is yours. For as long as we both live, we're in this together." Max stood, walked over to her chair, and rested his head on her knee. She stroked his soft ears and felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. She was 70 years old. She was living alone in a cabin in the woods. By most measures, her life hadn't turned out the way she'd planned, but she had a home she loved. She had financial security. She had her dignity, and she had Max. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Nancy had been living in her restored cabin for 6 months when Derek finally found her. It was a Saturday afternoon in December 2020, almost exactly 1 year after she and Max had stumbled upon the cabin in a rainstorm. Nancy was sitting on her porch in a warm coat, watching snow fall through the pines, when she heard a car engine. A luxury SUV, brand new by the look of it, came up the forestry road and parked in the small cleared area Nancy used for her own much more modest vehicle. Derek got out. He was wearing expensive casual clothes and designer sunglasses. He looked around at the property with an expression Nancy couldn't quite read. Then he saw her on the porch, and his face broke into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mom, I've been looking everywhere for you." Nancy said nothing, just watched him approach. Max, who'd been lying at her feet, stood up and positioned himself between Nancy and Derek, not growling but clearly alert and protective. "Nice place," Derek said, climbing the porch steps. How did you—" He seemed genuinely confused. "How did I end up here?" Nancy asked calmly. "I walked. After you left me at the bus station with $50, I walked into the forest with Max. We found this cabin. We survived. I heard you'd come into some money," Derek said, and there it was, the real reason he was here. "Someone in town mentioned that Nancy Morrison from Burlington sold some kind of coin collection for millions. That's you, isn't it?" "It is," Nancy confirmed. "That's incredible. That's amazing. Where did you find— this is great news." Derek was practically bouncing with excitement. "We need to talk about how to invest it, how to manage it properly. I've been taking some business courses, learning about wealth management. I can help you. We can work together on this." "Why are you here, Derek?" Nancy asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "I'm here because I heard my mother struck it rich, and I wanted to make sure she's okay, that she's making good decisions." "You're here because you want my money," Nancy said flatly. Derek's smile faltered. "That's not fair. I'm here because I care about you." "Where was that care a year ago?" Nancy asked. "Where was it when you sold my home out from under me? When you left me on a sidewalk with $50 and nowhere to go? When you suggested I have my dog put down because he was inconvenient for you?" "I made some mistakes," Derek said, his tone becoming defensive. "I was under a lot of stress. My business was failing. I wasn't thinking clearly." "Your business was failing," Nancy repeated. "So you threw away your 70-year-old mother like garbage." "I didn't throw you away. You called me a burden," Nancy interrupted, her voice still calm but hard as steel. "You said you couldn't afford to subsidize my life. You made me homeless. You expected me to die out here, didn't you? Or at least to disappear and stop being your problem." Derek shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I said I made mistakes, I'm sorry. But we're family. We should be working together. That money, you can't manage it all by yourself. You need help. You need family." "I have family," Nancy said. She reached down and placed her hand on Max's head. "This is my family. Max stayed with me when I had nothing. He kept me alive through the worst time of my life. He found the treasure that you now want a piece of. He's more family to me than you've ever been." "He's a dog," Derek said, frustration creeping into his voice. "He's loyal," Nancy countered. "Something you know nothing about." "So that's it?" Derek's tone turned angry. "You're just going to cut me out? I'm your son." "You cut yourself out," Nancy replied. "The moment you chose your convenience over my welfare, you stopped being my son in any way that matters. Biology doesn't make you family. Love does. Loyalty does. Sacrifice does. You've shown me none of those things." "I came here to apologize," Derek shouted. "I came here to make things right." "No," Nancy said, standing up. Max immediately pressed against her leg, still watching Derek warily. "You came here because you heard I have money. If I was still living in poverty in this cabin, would you be here? If I had nothing to offer you, would you have tracked me down?" Derek didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I thought so," Nancy said. "Here's what's going to happen, Derek. You're going to leave. You're not welcome here. You won't get any of my money. Nothing. When I die, everything I have will go to animal rescue organizations in Max's name. You get nothing." "You can't do that," Derek protested. "I'm your only child." "Then perhaps you should have acted like it," Nancy replied. "When I needed you, you failed me. Now that you need me, I'm returning the favor. Goodbye, Derek." "This is crazy. You're letting a dog influence you. You're not thinking straight." Nancy walked to the edge of the porch, effectively ending the conversation. "This property is private. You're trespassing. If you don't leave now, I'll call the sheriff." Derek stared at her, his face cycling through emotions. Anger, disbelief, desperation. Finally, he turned and walked back to his expensive SUV. Before getting in, he turned back one last time. "You'll regret this. When you're old and need help, you'll regret cutting me out." Nancy looked at him with something like pity. "Derek, I'm already old, and the only thing I regret is wasting 70 years hoping you'd become the man I thought you were." Derek slammed his car door and drove away fast enough to spray dirt and snow. Nancy stood on her porch, watching until the sound of his engine faded completely. Then she sat back down in her rocking chair. Max climbed into her lap, a feat, given that he was a 70-pound golden retriever, but Nancy didn't mind. She wrapped her arms around him and buried her face in his soft fur. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're okay. We have each other. That's all we need." Max licked her face gently, offering comfort the only way he knew how. Nancy realized she was crying, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of liberation. She'd spent 70 years defining herself partially through her role as Derek's mother, always hoping he'd appreciate her, value her, love her the way she loved him. Now she was free of that hope, free of that disappointment. She was just Nancy, and that was enough. 2 years after finding the cabin, Nancy Morrison sat on her porch on a warm summer afternoon, watching Max chase a butterfly through the clearing. He was 14 now, moving slower, sleeping more, his muzzle completely white, but he was happy, healthy, and still every bit her loyal companion. Nancy was 72. Her hair was completely silver now, pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face showed the lines of 7 decades of life, but her eyes were bright, her smile genuine. She'd spent the past 2 years living exactly as she wanted, simply, peacefully, without anyone's permission or approval. She'd made a few friends in the nearby town. She volunteered at the local animal shelter once a week. She donated generously to causes she cared about, especially organizations that helped homeless people and rescued senior dogs. She'd set up a trust fund that would, after her death, provide ongoing support for these organizations. Derek would get nothing, just as she'd promised. She didn't hate her son. She'd reached a place beyond hatred into something closer to indifference. He'd made his choices. She'd made hers. They were both living with the consequences. A car was coming up the road now, and Nancy smiled. She'd been expecting this visitor. Robert Chen, the coin dealer who'd helped her sell Ezekiel Stone's collection, parked and got out, waving cheerfully. "Nancy, how's retirement treating you?" "I'm 72, Robert. I was already retired when you met me." "Fair point," he laughed, climbing the porch steps. Max came running over, tail wagging, and Robert dutifully petted him. "And how's my favorite treasure hunter?" "Max is doing great. Getting older, but aren't we all?" Robert had become a genuine friend over the past 2 years. He'd never asked for anything, never tried to take advantage of her windfall. He just seemed to genuinely enjoy checking in on the unlikely success story he'd helped create. "I brought you something," Robert said, handing her an envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Boston Globe, dated last week. "The Gold Hermit of Vermont, Ezekiel Stone's Lost Treasure." The article told the whole story, how Stone had made his fortune in the California gold rush, retired to Vermont as a hermit, and hidden his wealth in a cabin that remained undiscovered for 150 years, until an elderly woman and her dog stumbled upon it during a desperate moment. Nancy had agreed to be interviewed for the story, but only under one condition, that it focus on Ezekiel Stone's fascinating life, not on her personal circumstances. "It's a good article," she said, reading through it. "They did him justice." "They did," Robert agreed, "but they also made you sound pretty heroic, surviving in an abandoned cabin at 70 years old with only her dog for company." "That's the stuff of legends, Nancy." "I wasn't trying to be heroic," Nancy replied. "I was trying to survive. There's a difference." "Is there?" Robert asked. "Because from where I sit, surviving when everything's against you is the most heroic thing there is." Nancy considered this. Maybe. But Max did most of the heroic work. He's the one who found the cabin. He's the one who found the treasure. He's the one who kept me going when I wanted to give up. If there's a hero in this story, it's him. As if on cue, Max wandered over and collapsed at Nancy's feet with a contented sigh. Robert laughed. "Well, he's earned his retirement. How long do Goldens usually live?" 10 to 12 years, typically," Nancy said, running her hand over Max's head. "He's 14 now. Every day with him is a gift." "You ever think about getting another dog?" Robert asked. "You know, for when Max is gone," Nancy finished the uncomfortable thought. "Yes, I think about it. The shelter I volunteer at has so many senior dogs that no one wants. Maybe I'll adopt 1 or 2. Keep the tradition going of taking in the dogs that nobody else will." "That sounds perfect," Robert said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the afternoon light filter through the pine trees. Finally, Robert spoke again. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. I may not answer. Do you ever regret it? The choices you made? The relationship with your son?" Nancy thought about this carefully. "No. I regret that he became the kind of person who could abandon his mother. I regret that I couldn't teach him better. But I don't regret choosing my own dignity over his demands. I don't regret refusing to let him back in when he only wanted my money." She paused, then continued. "You know what I realized? For 70 years I defined my worth partly through other people's perception of me. Was I a good wife, a good mother, a good neighbor? I let other people's judgment matter too much. And now?" Robert asked. "Now I know that my worth isn't determined by anyone else. Not by Derek, not by society, not by anyone. I survived impossible circumstances. I built a life I love. I have Max. I have friends. I have peace." She smiled. "I have everything that matters." "That's a good philosophy," Robert said. "It's a hard-earned philosophy," Nancy corrected. "I wouldn't recommend my path to anyone. But I also wouldn't trade where I ended up." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Robert said his goodbyes and headed back to town. Nancy remained on her porch with Max, watching the day fade into evening. Somewhere out there, Derek was living his life, probably still resentful, possibly still struggling. She wished him no harm, but she also felt no obligation to help him. He'd made his choices. She'd made hers. Inside the cabin, in a place of honor above the fireplace, hung the journal of Ezekiel Stone. Nancy had kept it, treasuring it as the key to the miracle that saved her life. Sometimes she'd read entries aloud to Max, imagining the lonely hermit who'd lived here 150 years ago, who'd hidden his treasure for someone worthy to find. "Thank you, Ezekiel," she'd whisper. "Thank you for this home. Thank you for this second chance." As darkness fell, Nancy called Max inside. He followed her to the cozy interior, now warm with the heat from the fireplace and glowing with soft lamplight. She prepared their dinner. These days, she could afford nice food for both of them. Max got premium dog food and frequent treats. She cooked real meals, healthy and satisfying. After dinner, as had become their ritual, Nancy sat in her reading chair while Max settled into his luxurious bed. She read aloud to him. Tonight it was a novel about adventure and loyalty, themes that seemed appropriate. Max's breathing grew slower, deeper, as he drifted towards sleep. Nancy set down her book and just watched him for a while, this faithful companion who'd saved her life in every way that mattered. "Good night, Max," she whispered. "Sweet dreams, my hero." Max's tail thumped once against his bed in response. Nancy turned down the lamps and settled into her own bed, a real bed with a real mattress, in a real home that was hers and no one could take away. Outside, the forest whispered its nighttime songs. Inside, Nancy Morrison, once homeless and abandoned, now safe and content, fell asleep with a smile on her face. She'd learned the hardest way that blood isn't always thicker than water. That family isn't about biology. It's about who stays when things get hard. She'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the catalyst for your greatest transformation. And she'd learned that the loyalty of a good dog is worth more than all the gold in the world. Nancy had found her treasure, but it wasn't in Ezekiel Stone's box of coins. It was in the faithful brown eyes of a 12-year-old golden retriever who'd refused to let her give up. That was the real miracle. And it was more than enough. If Nancy and Max's story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We share powerful true stories every week about resilience, second chances, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been saved by the loyalty of an animal? Has a pet ever gotten you through the darkest time of your life? Share your story. It might inspire someone who needs to hear it today. Nancy Morrison's journey teaches us profound truths about loyalty, family, and what really matters in life. She learned that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who stays when times get hard. Derek was her biological son, but Max was her true family. The dog who stayed when her son left. The dog who found treasure when her son took everything. Nancy's story also reminds us that it's never too late for a second chance. At 70 years old, homeless and abandoned, she could have given up. Instead, with Max by her side, she survived, thrived, and built a life richer than money could measure. Most importantly, Nancy's story teaches us about loyalty, both giving it and recognizing it. Max's loyalty saved Nancy's life in every way that mattered. He kept her moving when she wanted to stop. He found the cabin that sheltered them. He discovered the treasure that secured their future. And Nancy's loyalty to Max, her refusal to abandon him even when it would have been easier, her determination to share everything with him, her commitment to giving him the best life possible. That loyalty is what makes this story beautiful. When Derek returned, wealthy and interested only when Nancy had money, she chose Max, chose loyalty over blood, chose the one who'd stayed over the one who'd left. That's not revenge, that's justice. That's recognizing value where it actually exists. Your worth isn't determined by how others treat you. It's determined by how you treat others, especially when it costs you something. Nancy proved her worth by staying loyal to Max even when it meant living in a ruin. Max proved his worth by staying loyal to Nancy even when she had nothing to offer. Together, they found treasure. But the real treasure was each other. If you're going through hard times right now, remember Nancy and Max. Remember that loyalty matters more than gold. Remember that the darkest moments can lead to unexpected miracles. Remember that it's never too late to start over. And if you have an animal in your life who loves you unconditionally, treasure them. They're offering you something more valuable than any fortune, pure, loyal, unchanging love. Thank you for watching Nancy and Max's incredible journey. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in second chances, and give your own pets an extra hug today. They deserve it. We'll see you in the next story.